The day I fought beside humans and learned real fear. Part 1. Zethakar stood on the observation deck of the Coalition cruiser Harmony's Edge, watching the blue-white star of the Kepler system grow larger through the reinforced viewport. His scaled fingers drummed against the metal railing as he waited for his orders. At 8 feet tall with emerald scales that could deflect most energy weapons, Zethkar was considered one of the finest warriors the Corvani had ever produced. His bio-armor integrated seamlessly with his natural defenses, creating a living weapon that had never known defeat in 12 years of service. The door hissed open behind him, and Commander Velthos approached with heavy steps. The older Corvani's scarred hide told stories of countless battles across the galaxy. His expression was grim as he handed Zethkar a datapad. "New assignment," Velthos said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Colony world Kepler 442b has gone dark. Last transmission indicated a possible devourer incursion. You'll be leading a joint strike force to investigate and evacuate any survivors." Zethkar's eyes flicked over the mission details, his interest growing until he reached the personnel roster. His enthusiasm died instantly. "Joint force? With whom?" "The humans," Velthos replied, noting Zethkar's expression. "They're our newest coalition members. Consider this a test of their combat readiness." "Humans?" Zethkar's voice carried clear disdain. "Those soft-skinned primitives who barely discovered faster-than-light travel? Commander, I could handle this mission alone. Why burden me with untested recruits?" Velthos studied his subordinate carefully. "Because the Coalition Council has decreed it. The humans may be new, but they've shown surprising capabilities in their limited engagements. Do not underestimate them." "What capabilities could they possibly have?" Zethkar asked, gesturing to his own imposing form. "They have no natural armor, no enhanced reflexes, no bioweapons. They're barely evolved beyond their planet's other mammals." "Perhaps," Velthos said quietly, "but they've survived long enough to reach the stars despite having none of those advantages. That should tell you something." 3 hours later, Zethkar found himself in Docking Bay 7, watching as a human transport ship approached through the magnetic field. The vessel was crude by Corvani standards, all hard angles and exposed metal plating. It looked more like a flying brick than a proper military craft. As it settled onto the deck with a series of mechanical groans, Zethkar wondered if it would even survive atmospheric entry. The transport's cargo bay opened with a pneumatic hiss, and 12 figures emerged. Zethkar's first impression was disappointment. The humans were even smaller than he'd expected, the tallest barely reaching his chest. Their skin looked fragile and pale, stretched over delicate bone structures that seemed inadequate for serious combat. They wore bulky armor that appeared primitive compared to his bio-integrated systems, and their weapons were simple kinetic projectile throwers, technology the Corvani had abandoned centuries ago. The human leading the group approached with confident strides. Despite being at least 2 feet shorter than Zethkar, she showed no signs of intimidation. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight knot, and her brown eyes held a steady gaze that seemed to take in everything around her. "Sergeant Maria Vasquez, Earth Defense Corps," she said, extending a small hand in the human greeting gesture. "You must be our Corvani liaison." Zethkar looked down at the offered hand with distaste. "Sub-Commander Zethkar of the Corvani 4th Assault Legion. I will be leading this mission." Vasquez's expression didn't change, but she slowly lowered her hand. "Understood, Sub-Commander. My team is ready for briefing whenever you are." As Zethkar led them to the briefing room, he couldn't help but notice how the humans moved. They were quiet, unnaturally so for such primitive beings. Their footsteps barely registered on his enhanced hearing, and they seemed to instinctively spread out into defensive positions without any apparent communication. It was mildly impressive, he admitted, but hardly enough to matter in real combat. The briefing room's holographic display showed Kepler 442b in 3 dimensions. The planet's surface was covered in what looked like a growing organic mass, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns. Dark structures rose from the surface like twisted trees, connected by veins of the same organic material. "Typical devourer infestation pattern," Zethkar explained, manipulating the display to show cross-sections of the alien constructs. "They consume all organic matter and convert it into biomass for their expansion. The colonists, if any survive, will be in the underground emergency shelters here, and here." Red markers appeared on the display. One of the humans, a young male with nervous eyes, raised his hand. "Sub-Commander, what exactly are devourers?" I mean, we've read the files, but living nightmares, Zethkar replied curtly. They're a hive mind species that views all other life as food. They don't just kill. They consume their victims slowly, keeping them alive as long as possible to preserve the meat. They've destroyed 17 colony worlds in the past 50 years. The humans exchanged glances, but their expressions remained steady. Zethkar found this mildly surprising. Most species showed at least some fear when first learning about devourers. Sergeant Vasquez leaned forward, studying the display. What's our extraction plan? If there are survivors in those shelters, we'll need to move fast. The plan is simple, Zethkar said. We land here, eliminate any devourer resistance, and extract the survivors. My bioarmor can withstand their acid attacks, and my plasma weapons will make short work of their constructs. Your role will be to secure the landing zone and assist with evacuation. Assist? The word came from a different human, a stocky male with graying hair and scars on his hands. Sub-Commander, with respect, we didn't come here to stand around and watch. Zethkar's eyes narrowed. What's your name, human? Corporal Jackson, sir. Well, Corporal Jackson, your species has no experience with devourers. You have no natural defenses against their bioweapons, and your primitive kinetic weapons will barely scratch their carapaces. I'm trying to keep you alive. Jackson's jaw tightened, but Vasquez placed a restraining hand on his arm. We appreciate the concern, Sub-Commander, she said diplomatically. But Earth Command assigned us to this mission for a reason. We may not have bioarmor, but we've dealt with hostile life forms before. On your single planet, against your own native species, Zethkar scoffed. This is different. Devourers are intelligent, coordinated, and absolutely ruthless. They don't just want to kill you, they want to eat you alive. So do sharks, Jackson muttered. We learned to deal with those too. Zethkar didn't understand the reference, but the tone was clear enough. These humans actually thought they could contribute meaningfully to the mission. Their ignorance was almost amusing. Very well, he said finally. But when we land, you follow my orders exactly. No heroics, no improvisation. Do what I tell you when I tell you, and you might survive long enough to return to your little blue world. Vasquez nodded crisply. Understood, Sub-Commander. We're ready when you are. As the briefing ended and the humans filed out to prepare their equipment, Zethkar remained behind, studying the holographic planet. He'd fought beside many species over the years. The crystalline Zephyrians with their energy shields, the cybernetic Nexus with their tactical networks, the massive Garathi with their incredible strength. Each had brought something valuable to the battlefield. These humans, however, seemed to bring nothing but vulnerability. They were small, soft, and armed with weapons that belonged in a museum. Zethkar wondered if this mission would end with him carrying 12 human corpses back to their homeworld. The thought bothered him more than he cared to admit. Despite their primitive nature, there was something about the humans that he couldn't quite identify. The way they'd listened to his description of the devourers without flinching, the quiet confidence in their movements, the complete lack of deference despite his obvious physical superiority. Perhaps they were simply too ignorant to understand the danger they were walking into. Or perhaps, as Commander Velthos had suggested, there was more to them than met the eye. Either way, Zethkar would know soon enough. In 6 hours, they would be landing on Kepler 442b, and the humans would face their first real test among the stars. The Day I Fought Beside Humans and Learned Real Fear, Part 2. The dropship shuddered as it entered Kepler 442b's atmosphere, its hull glowing cherry red from the friction. Zethkar checked his bioarmor's readings one final time, ensuring all systems were functioning properly. Around him, the humans made their own preparations with quiet efficiency that he found oddly professional for such primitive beings. He watched as Sergeant Vasquez moved through her team, checking each soldier's equipment with practiced eyes. The humans had exchanged their bulky transport gear for sleeker combat armor, though it still looked crude compared to Corvani biotech. Their weapons remained the same kinetic projectile throwers, but Zethkar noticed they carried an unusual variety of ammunition types and accessories. 2 minutes to landing, the pilot announced, over the comm system. Corporal Jackson was doing something strange, near the back of the dropship. He'd pulled out a small rectangular object and was staring at it intently. Zethkar's enhanced vision caught a glimpse of the image. 2 smaller humans and an adult female, all bearing Jackson's facial features. What is that? Zethkar asked, genuinely curious. Jackson looked up, slightly embarrassed. Family photo. My wife and kids back on Earth. Why do you carry it into battle? Reminds me what I'm fighting for, Jackson replied simply, tucking the photo back into his armor. Zethakar found this behavior puzzling. Corvani warriors trained to suppress all emotional attachments during combat. Distractions led to mistakes, and mistakes led to death. Yet here was this human deliberately carrying reminders of emotional bonds into a potentially lethal situation. The dropship touched down with a bone-jarring impact, and the cargo bay doors began opening before they'd fully settled. Zethkar was first out, his enhanced senses immediately cataloging the environment. The air was thick with an organic smell, sweet and rotting at the same time. The sky above was a sickly green color, and strange spores drifted through the atmosphere like snow. The landscape before them had once been a thriving agricultural colony. Now it was a nightmare of twisted biomass. Organic structures rose from the ground like cancerous growths, connected by pulsing veins that carried nutrients and information throughout the Devourer network. The buildings of the human settlement were still visible, but they were being slowly consumed and converted into more alien architecture. Form up, Zethkar commanded, activating his bioarmor's full defensive systems. Scales shifted and hardened along his limbs, and targeting systems came online behind his eyes. Stay close and follow my lead. The humans spread out in a formation that Zethkar didn't recognize but seemed militarily sound. They moved with careful steps, weapons raised and ready. Their leader, Vasquez, gestured with hand signals that her team responded to instantly. They'd advanced barely 100 meters when Zethkar's motion sensors detected movement. Something large was approaching from behind a converted storage building, moving with the characteristic skittering gait of a Devourer scout. Contact, Zethkar whispered into his comm. Single scout moving to intercept. Stay back while The creature rounded the corner before he could finish. It stood 7 feet tall on 6 chitinous legs with a torso that was part insect, part something worse. Its head was the most disturbing feature, a grotesque fusion of its original form and the partially digested face of a human colonist. The victim's features were still recognizable, twisted into an expression of eternal agony. Several of the humans made quiet sounds of disgust, but none of them broke formation or showed signs of panic. Zethkar was mildly impressed. Many veteran soldiers had fled upon seeing their first Devourer scout. The creature's compound eyes fixed on their group, and it began transmitting their location to the hive mind through bioelectrical pulses. Zethkar raised his plasma rifle, preparing to eliminate the threat before it could complete its report. A human hand touched his arm. Corporal Jackson had moved beside him, weapon ready. Sub-Commander, that thing's calling for backup, right? Yes, I'll destroy it before— What if we use that? Jackson interrupted. Let it call them but lead them away from our target zone? Zethkar stared at the human. You want to deliberately attract more Devourers? Not attract, misdirect. Jackson's eyes never left the scout as he spoke. If I move toward Sector 7, it'll track me and report my position. The response force will head there instead of where we actually need to go. That's suicide, Zethkar said flatly. You'd be alone against an unknown number of hostiles. Jackson glanced at the photo of his family, then back at the creature. Sometimes one person takes the risk so everyone else can complete the mission. Before Zethkar could stop him, Jackson sprinted toward the Devourer scout, firing his primitive kinetic weapon as he ran. The creature's attention immediately focused on the human, and its bioelectrical signals shifted to track the new threat. Jackson led it on a chase toward the abandoned mining sector, drawing it further and further from their intended path. The humans watched their comrade disappear into the alien landscape without protest, though Zethkar noticed several of them gripping their weapons tighter. Vasquez's jaw was set in a hard line, but she didn't countermand Jackson's decision. He's buying us time, she said quietly. We need to move now, before the response force realizes they've been misdirected. Zethkar found himself reluctantly following the human sergeant's lead as they advanced toward the first emergency shelter. The experience was deeply unsettling. In Corvani military doctrine, individual sacrifice was sometimes necessary, but it was always ordered by superior officers after careful calculation. No soldier was expected to make such decisions independently, yet Jackson had done exactly that, seemingly without hesitation. He'd evaluated the tactical situation, identified a solution that required personal sacrifice, and implemented it without waiting for orders. It was either incredibly stupid or incredibly brave, and Zethkar wasn't sure which disturbed him more. They reached the entrance to the first shelter without encountering any devourers. The biosealed door was intact, and Zethkar's sensors detected multiple life signs behind the thick metal barriers. His plasma cutter made quick work of the locking mechanism, and the door swung open to reveal 32 human colonists huddled in the emergency chamber. The survivors were in poor condition, malnourished, dehydrated, and showing signs of severe psychological trauma. Some clutched personal belongings, while others stared at nothing with empty eyes. The youngest was a girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, clinging to a stuffed animal that had seen better days. "How long have you been down here?" Vasquez asked the ranking colonist, a middle-aged man whose administrative uniform marked him as the settlement coordinator. 18 days, he replied, his voice hoarse from dehydration. "They came at night. The warning sirens barely had time to sound before those things were everywhere. We sealed ourselves in and hoped someone would come." Zethkar was already calculating extraction logistics when one of his soldiers, Private Chen, approached Vasquez with concern evident on her face. "Sergeant, I'm reading massive bioelectrical activity moving toward Sector 7, Chen reported. "Whatever Jackson stirred up, it's bigger than we expected." The implications hit Zethkar immediately. Jackson hadn't just drawn away a simple response force. He'd attracted the attention of something much larger and more dangerous. The human was now facing odds that would challenge even a fully equipped Corvani assault team. "Can we reach him?" Vasquez asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Negative," Zethkar replied after checking his tactical display. "The distance is too great and we have civilians to evacuate. By the time we could mount a rescue operation..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood that Jackson was likely already dead or worse. Devourers didn't kill quickly when they had time to savor their prey. What surprised Zethkar was the humans' reaction to this news. Instead of grief or anger, they seemed to become more focused and determined. Their movements became sharper, their formation tighter. It was as if Jackson's sacrifice had somehow strengthened their resolve rather than weakening it. "He knew what he was doing," Vasquez said firmly. "We honor his choice by completing the mission." "All civilians accounted for?" As they began moving the survivors toward the extraction point, Zethkar found himself studying the humans with new interest. He'd expected them to be weakened by the loss of their comrade, perhaps even demoralized enough to compromise the mission. Instead, they'd absorbed the blow and adapted with remarkable resilience. The little girl with the stuffed animal stumbled during the evacuation, and one of the human soldiers, a young man barely out of adolescence, immediately scooped her up and carried her without complaint. Another soldier shared his water ration with an elderly colonist who was struggling with dehydration. These small acts of care puzzled Zethkar. Corvani doctrine emphasized efficiency above all else. Resources were allocated based on tactical value and probability of survival. Emotional attachments were considered weaknesses that compromised decision-making ability. Yet these humans seemed to operate on an entirely different principle. They formed bonds not just with their own species, but with strangers they'd never met before. The Day I Fought Beside Humans and Learned Real Fear, Part 3. The second shelter held 43 survivors, including a group of children from the colony's primary school. Their teacher, a woman named Sarah Martinez, had managed to keep them calm for 18 days with nothing but stories and songs. When the shelter door opened, the children didn't run to their rescuers. They stayed in perfect formation behind their teacher, exactly as she'd trained them. Zethkar watched the humans work with the survivors and noticed something he'd missed before. Each soldier seemed to know exactly how to interact with different types of civilians. Private Chen spoke softly to the traumatized children, while Corporal Williams helped the elderly colonists with their medical needs. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty about their roles. "How do they know what to do?" Zethkar asked Vasquez as they prepared to move to the third shelter. "Know what to do about what?" "The civilians. Your soldiers interact with them as if they've had specialized training, but your files indicate they're combat troops, not humanitarian specialists." Vasquez looked puzzled by the question. "They're people, Sub-Commander. You help people however they need help." This answer only confused Zethkar more. Corvani soldiers were trained for specific roles and missions. They didn't improvise social interactions with civilian populations. Yet these humans seemed to do it naturally without any apparent training or doctrine. The third shelter was different. When they breached the door, they found it empty except for signs of a struggle. Bloodstains marked the walls, and the emergency supplies had been scattered across the floor. Claw marks scored the metal surfaces, and there was an acrid smell that Zethkar's sensors identified as devourer bioacid. They found this one, Private Davis said quietly, kneeling beside a torn piece of fabric that had once been someone's shirt. Vasquez nodded grimly. How long ago? Zethkar consulted his biosensors. Based on the acid degradation patterns, approximately 6 hours. The survivors were taken alive. Taken where? To the primary hive structure. Zethkar pointed toward the massive organic complex that dominated the colony's former industrial district. That's where they process organic matter for consumption. The humans exchanged glances that Zethkar was beginning to recognize. It was the same look they'd shared when Jackson had made his sacrifice. A wordless communication that seemed to reach some collective decision. What's the tactical situation at the hive? Vasquez asked. Suicide, Zethkar replied bluntly. The structure will be heavily defended and the survivors are most likely already dead. Even if they're not, attempting a rescue would require... How many people were in that shelter? Vasquez interrupted. Zethkar checked his datapad. 18. Mostly families with young children. They could still be alive. Technically possible, but highly unlikely. Devourers prefer to keep their food fresh, but the process of preparing organic matter for consumption is unpleasant. Most victims don't survive the preliminary stages. Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, staring at the blood-stained walls. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It was harder somehow, with an edge that made Zethkar's instincts prickle with unease. What would it take to get inside that hive? Are you seriously considering this? Zethkar asked. It's a fortress designed by a species that's been perfecting biowarfare for millennia. The interior will be filled with acid pools, organic weapon systems, and processing chambers that would drive most beings insane just by witnessing them. That's not what I asked. Zethkar studied the human sergeant's face. Her expression was calm, but there was something in her eyes that he couldn't identify. It wasn't madness, he'd seen that before. It wasn't even typical battle fury. It was something colder and more focused. The main entrance is here, he said finally, activating his tactical display. It's guarded by at least 12 mature warriors and possibly twice that number of drones. The internal structure is organic and constantly shifting, so we can't rely on static maps. And even if we could fight our way inside, the pheromone concentrations would affect most species' nervous systems within minutes. What about humans? I don't have data on human resistance to devourer biochemicals. Then we'll find out. Vasquez turned to her team. Equipment check. Full combat loadout. We're going into that hive. The soldiers began preparing their gear with practiced efficiency. Zethkar watched in amazement as they transformed their simple kinetic weapons into something more complex. Grenade launchers were attached to rifle barrels. Specialized ammunition was distributed, and strange devices he didn't recognize were clipped to their armor. Sergeant, this is madness, Zethkar protested. Those 18 people are most likely dead. You're proposing to sacrifice 11 more lives for nothing. Maybe, Vasquez replied, checking the action on her weapon. But maybe not. And we don't leave people behind if there's any chance they're still alive. This isn't rational behavior. No, she agreed. It's not. The approach to the hive was a nightmare landscape of organic architecture and biological hazards. Acid pools bubbled along the path, and sensing organs tracked their movement from hidden positions. The air grew thicker with each step, filled with spores and pheromones that made even Zethkar's enhanced respiratory system work harder. The humans seemed less affected by the environment than he'd expected. Their primitive breathing apparatus was actually proving more effective than his bioarmor's filtration systems. Whatever they'd done to modify their equipment, it was working. The first wave of defenders appeared as they reached the hive's outer perimeter. 6 devourer warriors emerged from concealed positions, their chitinous armor gleaming with acid secretions. Each creature stood 8 feet tall and moved with predatory grace that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary perfection. Zethkar raised his plasma rifle, preparing to engage the creatures with standard Corvani tactics. What happened next changed everything he thought he knew about humans. Instead of taking defensive positions or attempting to match the devourer's mobility, the humans did something unexpected. They spread out in a formation that seemed to invite attack, then waited. When the creatures charged, the humans didn't retreat or try to establish firing lanes. They went forward. The sound of human weapons firing in sustained bursts filled the air, but it wasn't the wild spraying that Zethkar had expected from primitive kinetic weapons. Every shot was placed with surgical precision, targeting joints and weak points that the humans shouldn't have been able to identify. Their ammunition was doing far more damage than it should have been capable of inflicting. But what truly shocked Zethkar was the humans' movement. They flowed around the devourers like water, never presenting static targets, always maintaining overlapping fields of fire. It was a level of tactical coordination that should have required years of training and enhanced communication systems. When one of the creatures managed to get close enough to use its bioacid spray, Private Martinez didn't retreat. Instead, she rolled forward under the stream of corrosive material and placed her weapon directly against the creature's thorax before emptying an entire magazine into its torso cavity. The devourer fell backward, dark fluids pooling around its corpse. Martinez emerged from the encounter with minor acid burns on her armor, but otherwise unharmed. She reloaded her weapon and moved to support her teammates without missing a beat. Within 3 minutes, all 6 creatures were dead. The humans had sustained no casualties and minimal equipment damage. Zethkar found himself staring at the battlefield in disbelief. How? He asked Vasquez. How what? How did you do that? Your weapons shouldn't have been effective against their armor. Your tactics were completely unlike anything in the Coalition combat manuals, and your coordination was impossible without enhanced communication systems. Vasquez shrugged. We've been fighting things that want to kill us for a long time, Sub-Commander. You learn to adapt. As they approached the hive entrance, Zethkar realized that his understanding of human capabilities had been completely wrong. These weren't primitive warriors stumbling through their first real combat experience. They were something else entirely. Predators, who'd learned to hunt creatures that should have been far beyond their capabilities. The entrance to the hive was a gaping maw lined with organic sensors and defensive organs. Bioluminescent veins pulsed along the walls, carrying information and nutrients throughout the structure. The smell of decay and digestion was overwhelming, even through his armor's filtration systems. Motion sensors indicate heavy activity deeper in the structure, Zethkar reported. Whatever's inside knows we're coming. Good, Vasquez replied, checking her weapon one final time. Let's go get our people. As they crossed the threshold into the hive, Zethkar found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. The humans around him were moving with quiet confidence into an environment that should have terrified any sane being. They showed no fear, no hesitation, no awareness that they were walking into a death trap designed by creatures that had been perfecting the art of killing for longer than most species had existed. Either they were too ignorant to understand the danger, or they simply didn't care. Zethkar was beginning to suspect it was the latter, and that realization was more unsettling than anything the Devourers could throw at them. The Day I Fought Beside Humans and Learned Real Fear, Part 4. The interior of the hive was a living nightmare that defied description. Walls pulsed with organic rhythms, and bioluminescent veins provided an eerie green glow that cast shifting shadows throughout the passages. The floor beneath their feet was soft and yielding, made from compressed organic matter that Zethkar preferred not to identify too closely. They'd been moving through the twisted corridors for 20 minutes when they encountered the first processing chamber. Through a translucent membrane that served as a viewing window, they could see what the Devourers did to their captured prey. 3 colonists hung suspended in organic cocoons, their bodies partially dissolved by digestive enzymes, while they remained conscious and aware. Feeding tubes had been inserted into their major organs, slowly draining their life force while keeping them alive for as long as possible. The victims' eyes moved frantically when they noticed the rescue team, but they couldn't speak through the biomatter that filled their mouths. Zethkar had seen many horrors in his military career, but this was beyond anything in his experience. The sheer cruelty of keeping prey alive and conscious during consumption was something that went beyond mere predation. It was torture elevated to an art form. 2 of his Corvani soldiers immediately began retching, their bioarmor's waste systems struggling to contain their bodies' reactions. Even his own enhanced constitution was severely tested by the sight. The humans' reaction was different. They became absolutely still, their faces taking on expressions that Zethkar had never seen before. It wasn't horror or revulsion, it was something colder and infinitely more dangerous. "Can we get them out?" Vasquez asked, her voice perfectly calm. "Not alive," Zethkar replied, checking his sensors. "The biointegration is too advanced. Removing them from the feeding apparatus would kill them instantly. Then we end their suffering," Private Martinez said quietly, raising her weapon. The mercy shots were quick and precise. The 3 colonists died instantly, their ordeal finally over. But Zethkar noticed that the humans didn't look away during the process. They watched everything, their faces carved from stone. "How many more chambers like this?" Vasquez asked. "Unknown. The hive structure is constantly shifting, but based on the bioelectrical activity, at least 6 more processing areas. Then we keep moving." As they progressed deeper into the hive, they found more chambers, each one revealing new horrors. In one room, devourer larvae were feeding on still living victims who'd been reduced to little more than torsos and heads. Another chamber contained what appeared to be some kind of breeding experiment, where human genetic material was being combined with devourer biomass. Each discovery seemed to affect the humans in a cumulative way. Their movements became more predatory, their formations tighter and more aggressive. They began moving through the corridors like wolves hunting in a pack, communicating through gestures and glances that seemed to convey complex tactical information. Zethkar found himself studying Sergeant Vasquez's face as they approached the central processing chamber. Her features had transformed into something that looked barely human. Her eyes had taken on a flat, emotionless quality that reminded him uncomfortably of apex predators he'd encountered on death worlds throughout the galaxy. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "perhaps we should consider extraction. We've confirmed that most of the missing colonists are dead. There's no tactical advantage to—" "There are children in there," she interrupted, pointing to the massive chamber ahead of them. Zethkar's sensors confirmed her statement. The central processing area contained multiple life signs, including several that registered as juvenile humans. They were still alive, though their bioelectrical readings suggested they were in severe distress. "The tactical situation is impossible," Zethkar protested. "That chamber will be heavily defended, and the pheromone concentrations are approaching lethal levels even for protected individuals. My own bioarmor is showing stress indicators. How many hostiles?" Zethkar consulted his readings. "At least 20 mature warriors, possibly more, plus an unknown number of support drones and defensive systems. It's a kill box, Sergeant. They want us to come in there." "Of course they do." Vasquez's smile was predatory and utterly without warmth. "They're hungry." What followed was unlike anything in Zethkar's military experience. The humans didn't attempt to negotiate or find an alternative approach. They didn't try to outflank the enemy or establish superior firing positions. Instead, they did something that violated every principle of tactical doctrine he'd ever learned. They walked straight into the trap. The central chamber was vast, with a cathedral-like ceiling that disappeared into organic darkness above. Processing stations lined the walls, each one containing suspended victims in various stages of consumption. At the center of the room, a cluster of human children huddled together in a holding pen made from living bone. The devourers were waiting for them, 23 mature warriors arranged in a perfect ambush formation. Their compound eyes tracked the intruders as they entered, and bioelectrical communication pulses crackled between them like malevolent lightning. Zethkar expected the humans to take cover, to establish defensive positions, to do something that made tactical sense. Instead, they spread out in a formation that seemed designed to present maximum vulnerability to enemy fire. "On my mark," Vasquez said quietly into her comm system. The devourers attacked as one, a coordinated assault that should have overwhelmed any force foolish enough to enter their domain. Acid sprays filled the air, chitinous claws gleamed in the bioluminescent light, and the creature's psychic screams began their work on the intruders' nervous systems. Zethkar felt the familiar terror that devourer pheromones were designed to induce. His bioarmor's chemical filters were failing, and primitive panic responses were beginning to override his training. Around him, several Corvani soldiers were showing signs of the same effect. The humans, however, seemed completely unaffected. They moved through the chaos like dancers following some predetermined choreography. Their weapons spoke in sustained bursts, each shot placed with impossible precision despite the swirling combat environment. They flowed around acid sprays and claw attacks as if they could predict their enemies' movements before they happened. But what truly shocked Zethkar was the sound they made. It wasn't the disciplined silence of professional soldiers or the battle cries of warriors. It was something else entirely, a low, sustained growling that seemed to come from deep in their chests. It was the sound that apex predators made when they encountered threats to their pack. Private Chen rolled under a devourer's acid spray and came up inside its reach, her weapon pressed against the creature's thorax. The entire magazine disappeared into the alien's torso in less than 2 seconds. As the creature fell, she was already moving toward the next target, her face wearing an expression of cold fury that made Zethkar's scales try to retract into his body. Corporal Williams found himself cornered by 2 warriors working in coordination. Instead of attempting to escape, he charged directly at them using his own body as a weapon. His equipment absorbed the damage from their claws while he systematically dismantled both creatures with point-blank gunfire. The battle lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. When it was over, 23 Devourer warriors lay dead or dying on the chamber floor. The humans had sustained minor injuries but no casualties. They immediately moved to free the surviving children, their predatory expressions melting away to reveal something resembling normal human emotion. Zethkar stood in the middle of the carnage, trying to process what he'd witnessed. The humans had just accomplished something that should have been impossible. They'd walked into a prepared ambush by superior numbers of biologically enhanced predators and emerged victorious with minimal effort. More disturbing than their tactical success was the way they'd achieved it. They hadn't fought like soldiers following doctrine or warriors driven by battle fury. They'd fought like something else entirely. Creatures that existed at the very top of some cosmic food chain, casually disposing of threats that other species considered nightmarish. "Sub-Commander," Vasquez called from across the chamber. "We need to move. My sensors are picking up massive bioelectrical activity heading this way." Zethkar looked at her and realized that he was seeing something no Corvani had ever witnessed before. These humans weren't the primitive, defenseless creatures he'd assumed them to be. They were predators, apex predators, who'd spent their entire evolutionary history learning to hunt and kill things that were bigger, stronger, and better armed than they were. The children clung to their rescuers as they moved toward the exit. One little girl, no more than 6 years old, looked up at Private Martinez and said, "Are the monsters gone?" "Yes, sweetheart," Martinez replied gently. "The monsters are gone." But as Zethkar watched the humans carry the children to safety, stepping over the corpses of creatures that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia, he began to understand that the real monsters in this equation might be the ones doing the rescuing. For the first time in his military career, Zethkar felt genuine fear, not of the enemy they'd just defeated, but of the allies who'd defeated them. The Day I Fought Beside Humans and Learned Real Fear, Part 5. The evacuation proceeded without incident until they reached the final transport. 87 survivors had been loaded aboard the Coalition vessels, including the 12 children they'd rescued from the hive's central chamber. The humans moved efficiently through their post-mission protocols, checking equipment and tending to the wounded with the same quiet competence they'd shown throughout the operation. Zethkar found himself watching Sergeant Vasquez as she helped an elderly colonist into the transport. Her movements were gentle and careful, her voice soft and reassuring. Nothing in her behavior suggested that 3 hours earlier, she'd been systematically executing alien predators with ruthless efficiency. The transformation was complete and unsettling. The predator he'd witnessed in the hive had vanished, replaced by someone who looked like a perfectly ordinary human female. If he hadn't seen her in combat, he would never have believed she was capable of the violence he'd witnessed. "Sub-Commander," she said, approaching him as the last survivors were secured. "I wanted to thank you for your support during the operation." "Thank me?" Zethkar's voice carried genuine confusion. "Sergeant, your people accomplished something today that should have been impossible. If anything, I should be thanking you." "For what?" "For showing me what humans are actually capable of." Vasquez studied his face with those same calm brown eyes that had surveyed a room full of devourer corpses without flinching. What do you think we're capable of, Sub-Commander? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Zethkar found himself choosing his words carefully, aware that he was treading on dangerous ground. I think, he said finally, that the galaxy has no idea what it's dealing with when it comes to your species. Is that good or bad? I honestly don't know. A small commotion near the transport interrupted their conversation. One of the rescued children, a boy of perhaps 8 years old, had broken away from the group and was approaching Private Chen. In his small hands, he carried something that made Zethkar's enhanced vision focus immediately. It was a crude drawing, obviously done with whatever materials the child had been able to find in the emergency shelter. The image showed stick figures in combat gear fighting against much larger creatures that were clearly meant to represent devourers. Above the scene, written in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for saving us." Chen knelt down to the boy's level, accepting the drawing with careful hands. "This is beautiful," she said softly. "What's your name?" "Tommy," the boy replied shyly. "Are you really soldiers from Earth?" "Yes, we are. My dad used to tell me stories about Earth. He said it was a scary place with lots of dangerous animals, but the people who lived there were braver than anybody else in the galaxy." Chen glanced at her teammates, then back at the child. "Your dad sounds like a smart man." "He got eaten by the monsters," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "But you killed them all, so now they can't eat anybody else, right?" "Right," Chen assured him. "The monsters are gone." Zethkar watched this exchange with growing unease. The child was treating the humans like heroes from some ancient legend, and they were accepting that role without question. But he'd seen what they were really like when the protective veneer of civilization was stripped away. As the transports prepared for departure, Zethkar made his way to the observation deck for a final look at Kepler 442b. The planet's surface was still covered with devourer biomass, but the hive structures were beginning to collapse without their controlling intelligence. Within a few months, the organic material would decompose, leaving behind a scarred but habitable world. "Impressive sight," a voice said behind him. Zethkar turned to find Vasquez standing in the doorway, still carrying that same calm expression that seemed to be her default setting. "Yes," he agreed. "Complete ecosystem collapse. It will take decades to restore this world to habitability." "That's not what I meant." She moved to stand beside him at the viewport. "I meant it's impressive that we got everyone out alive." "Not everyone," Zethkar reminded her. "Corporal Jackson knew what he was doing," she interrupted. "He made his choice and he saved lives because of it." "That's what we do." "That's what you do," Zethkar corrected. "I've served with many species over the years, Sergeant. I've seen incredible acts of valor and sacrifice, but what I witnessed today was different." "Different how?" Zethkar struggled to find the right words. "When you entered that hive, when you saw what the devourers had done to those people, something changed in all of you. You became something else entirely. We became what we needed to become. That's exactly what frightens me." Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dying planet below. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of sadness that Zethkar hadn't heard before. "Sub-Commander, do you have children?" "No. Corvani warriors don't typically form reproductive bonds until after retirement from active service." "I have a daughter," Vasquez said softly. "She's 6 years old, about the same age as that little girl we pulled out of the hive. Every night before I deployed on this mission, I tucked her into bed and told her that Mommy was going to help keep the galaxy safe for children like her." She turned to face him directly. "When I saw those kids in that processing chamber, when I saw what those things were doing to them, yes, something changed in me. In all of us, because that could have been our children. That could have been anyone's children. And that justifies what you did in there?" "It doesn't justify anything," she replied. "It explains it. Humans don't fight because we're naturally violent or because we enjoy killing. We fight because we love something enough to become monsters in order to protect it." Zethkar felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the ship's climate control. "And what happens when someone threatens what you love?" Vasquez's smile was gentle and terrifying in equal measure. "Then they find out why humans are the apex predators on a planet full of things that are bigger, stronger, and better armed than we are." Over the following days, as they made their way back to Coalition space, Zethkar found himself studying the mission reports and trying to understand what he'd witnessed. The official records would show a successful evacuation operation with minimal casualties and complete objective achievement. They would not capture the true significance of what had happened. The humans had revealed something fundamental about their nature, something that went beyond their primitive technology and unimpressive physical capabilities. They were a species that had evolved not just to survive, but to protect. And when that protective instinct was triggered, they became something that even creatures like the Devourers couldn't stand against. On his final night aboard the Harmony's Edge, Zethkar composed a personal log entry that would never be included in the official reports. Today I fought beside humans for the first time, and I learned something that I believe will change the balance of power in this galaxy. These beings appear weak and primitive by most standards, but they possess something that may be more valuable than any weapon or defensive system ever devised. They have the capacity to love something more than they fear death, and when that love is threatened, they become killers of such efficiency and ruthlessness that even creatures designed by evolution to be perfect predators cannot stand against them, have fought beside the crystalline Zephyrians with their energy shields, the cybernetic Nexus with their tactical networks, and the massive Garathi with their incredible strength. Each of these species brought impressive capabilities to the battlefield. The humans brought something else entirely. They brought the willingness to sacrifice everything, including their own humanity, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. They showed me that there are predators in this galaxy who hunt not for food or territory or resources, but for love. I pray that we never give them reason to hunt us. As Zethkar sealed the log entry and prepared for sleep, he found himself thinking about the drawing that little Tommy had given to Private Chen. In the child's simple artwork, the humans were depicted as heroes standing between innocent people and nightmarish monsters. The child had understood something that Zethkar was only beginning to grasp. The humans were heroes, but they were also the monsters. They were creatures capable of such violence that they could make the Devourers look tame by comparison. But they aimed that violence only at things that threatened their pack. For the first time in his military career, Zethkar was grateful that his species had chosen to ally with humanity rather than oppose them. Because he'd seen what happened to their enemies, and it was something that would haunt his dreams for years to come. The humans might look like soft, primitive mammals, but they were apex predators wearing the masks of civilization. And the most terrifying part was that they seemed to genuinely believe they were the good guys. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps that was what made them so dangerous. As sleep finally claimed him, Zethkar's last conscious thought was a prayer to whatever cosmic forces might be listening, that humanity would never have reason to see the rest of the galaxy as a threat to their pack. Because if that day ever came, he suspected that the universe itself might not be big enough to contain the consequences.